Welcome to Et Al., a podcast from Baylor University Press, where we interview authors and publishing experts to bring you the best scholarship in the fields of scriptural, historical, and theological studies, as well as the world of academic publishing. Thanks for joining us. Welcome, everybody, to Et Al., a podcast of Baylor University Press. I'm your host, Anna Kate, and we are joined today by two of Baylor's finest. We have with us William Wubbenhorst, who is the former Associate Commissioner for the Family and Youth Services Bureau, and currently a non-resident scholar at the Institute for the Studies of Religion at Baylor University. We also have with us Byron Johnson, who is the director of the Institute for the Studies of Religion and also a distinguished professor of the social sciences at Baylor University. We are so excited you guys could join us. Thank you so much for being here.
Happy to be here.
Happy to be here, Anna Kate.
And we're here today to discuss their forthcoming title, The Faith Factor in Social Welfare. This is such a necessary book. We're so excited for the work you guys have done and excited to have this conversation surrounding your books. And one of the main themes in the book are faith-based organizations, or FBOs. So I wonder if you guys could explain to us what constitutes an FBO, a faith-based organization, and what separates the work that FBOs are doing from other social welfare systems.
Well, faith-based organizations really undergird American civil society. They're everywhere. I don't care how small a town you visit, you will find faith-based organizations that exist. And some of these are under the radar. People don't see them very much. Others are very big, like World Vision or Compassion International or Salvation Army. These are groups that have been around for decades, and people know them and are very familiar with them. But the real work, I think, is done by these small groups that exist in all communities at every level. I mean, when you see a disaster like the unfortunate disaster in Texas, you have people responding to those disasters. And a lot of these are faith-based groups. They get very little recognition, but they do tons of work. And so William and I have felt like it's important to not overlook the contribution that they're making. So for the last several decades, we've done so many what we call case studies on these groups to kind of document what they're doing to help tell the story, because it's not insignificant. And in fact, we argue in the book that American society would look a lot different if we didn't have these groups.
Yeah, it is in the literature. It's an ongoing challenge of how do you define them. And other scholars like Stephen Monsma they've developed a continuum. For purposes of our textbook, we did further distinguish with what we call implicit versus explicit faith-based organizations. Implicit faith-based organizations, the staff are people of faith, the underlying curriculum is people of faith, but it is not, presented in an explicitly faith-based or Christian manner. These are often organizations that are trying to get government grants and contracts. Explicit faith-based organizations are very clear, not in the sense that they proselytize, but in the sense that their belief in their faith is clear to see. It's embedded in the curriculum, less likely to go after public funds as a result. But we talk about both implicit and explicit faith-based organizations in the textbook.
Yeah, and I appreciate that distinction because I think you're right that there are many organizations that maybe are associated with the faith and with Christianity, but are not undergirded, as you said, or maybe don't have those requirements for their staff. And so I think it is really helpful that you make that distinction. And so in what ways have your own respective work and ministry experience served as a foundation for a book like this? So maybe you can touch on what experience you've had personally with FBOs, and then also the ways that you've seen that ministry play out in your own life.
My first exposure was to Prison Fellowship, which was founded in 1976 by the former Watergate figure, Chuck Colson, who actually served time in prison after Watergate. And then he came to faith and said, I'm going to make this a part of my life to bring faith into prisons to help reform prisoners, because he felt that the whole issue of crime was a moral problem.
Yeah.
And so in the late 1990s, I began working with Prison Fellowship doing studies of these faith-based prison programs that were based on scripture. And we published a bunch of papers on Prison Fellowship, and that began a long journey then of thinking, okay, what other organizations are out there? What are they doing? Is anybody else doing an analysis of the work of these groups? And so that was my first exposure. And then, of course, William and I were introduced several decades ago. And we just have taken this on as a personal kind of a mission to bring attention to the work of these groups. Again, some of which are highly recognized, like Prison Fellowship, but most of which are not really highly recognized.
Hmm.
Yeah, and I just want to acknowledge too, one of our co-authors, also my wife, Alfreda Alvarez Wubbenhorst, couldn't join us today. She did some early work in domestic violence, community-based group out of Massachusetts. And we've both been involved in various local faith-based initiatives in our various locations. For me personally, my path, if you will, was sealed after I read Marvin Olasky's The Tragedy of American Compassion.
Hmm.
And he documents how central faith-based groups, churches, women's groups within churches were instrumental in meeting the needs of the community. And he also tracks how government became more and more involved over the years, starting with Roosevelt and capped off with Lyndon Johnson, and in many respects kind of eviscerated or at least made people less knowledgeable of the ongoing work of faith-based organizations. So really the process that led to the textbook, and again, shout out to Alfreda, she was the one who saw these pile of case studies and said, why don't you make it a textbook? And really the motivation was, this is a story that needs to be told. Byron can talk about in the formal academic research community how faith-based groups are, underreported. I think the case
Yeah.
studies are also in response to that. They have qualitative elements, they have quantitative elements, but the effort to tell the story and to create greater awareness of what these groups are doing is really what led to the publishing of the case studies and now culminating in the textbook.
Yeah. And I appreciate you bringing up your lovely wife and co-author. Yeah, Alfreda Alvarez Wubbenhorst, she's also a non-resident fellow at the Institute for the Studies of Religion at Baylor. And significantly, also, she's the co-founder of Harvest Home Institute, an organization which is dedicated to helping faith-based and community-based organizations to develop strategies and implement best practices for service to their communities. And so I think it is so important that, Byron, you brought in this prison organization that you were a part of, and William, how this book has kind of influenced you into these case studies and writing this book, and then the experience that Alfreda has had as well. I think it is important for listeners and for readers to realize that this isn't theoretical, right? This is hands on the ground. This is case studies. This is personal experience. It's not a perfect world, right? And it's not an idealistic view, but it definitely sheds light on the really important work that FBOs are doing in a very practical way. And I think that's one of the great benefits of this textbook, is that not only are you using case studies, but you're working from your own experience just as Christians and as authors. And so I think that's been super helpful in the way that this textbook can reach students and just Christians in general, people that are looking to make an impact in the community. And so I wonder if you guys could shed some light. Do you think that FBOs are actually effective in addressing issues such as homelessness, welfare, and violence? And if so, in what ways?
Yeah. Every case study that we've done, we've wanted to tackle the question you've just raised.
Yeah.
How effective are these groups? We're completely open to the possibility that they're not effective at all.
Right.
But by and large, these groups not only are effective, they're extremely effective. And of course, most of them rely only on private funds. Not all of them, but the vast majority raise funds. They're not, using government money, but they are tackling problems that the government struggles to tackle. And so when you mention homelessness, William and I did a case study that was published in 2017 on homelessness. And we found, using HUD data that 60% of the beds provided for homeless people were provided by faith-based organizations. Well, this is a huge finding. Not 2% or 1%, 60%.
Yeah.
But yet, if you look at housing and urban development and all the many studies that they produce on homelessness, there's no mention of faith-based groups.
Hmm.
And yet we found that the lion's share of beds are provided by them. I think this shows you, A, that they're on the ground, they're very active. Gospel rescue missions are in every major urban center in the country. And one of the things that William and I did, in addition to using empirical data from HUD, we actually interviewed people on the ground in these cities. We interviewed mayors.
Hmm.
And it doesn't matter if they're Republican or Democrat. These mayors said, what would we do without these faith-based groups?
Yeah, I think that the key to understanding is that whether the organizations get the recognition or not, they're doing the work. And as Byron said, in the case studies, we make every effort to find whatever data we can. Sometimes, like in the homeless study, we have governmental data. Other times, we don't have as much. But we've even gone so far as to develop a return on investment model in our analysis. And it basically says if you change a person's life trajectory, you're saving taxpayer dollars. So even in
Yeah.
situations where you may not personally have sympathy, obviously with ex-offenders, it's hard to get people sympathetic. However, if they're in prison, they're costing taxpayer dollars. If they're released and they're rearrested, they are putting a strain on the court system. You can talk about crime victims. So part of our argument is to simply indicate that this isn't just something on the periphery. These organizations are saving taxpayer dollars
Hmm.
through the outcomes that they produce. And so, we were very keenly aware that we didn't want to simply have qualitative stories. And in many cases, some more rigorous than others, we produce data in the case studies in the textbook to make the case.
And let me just add to that. A lot of the organizations that we've worked with, when we come in, they didn't quite understand the significance of what it meant to collect empirical data.
Hmm.
So we were a pain in the neck. It's kind of like, here come these guys, they want to collect all this data. Now we have to do these pre-test and these post-test surveys, and this is really a drain on us because we're already overworked and understaffed. But of course, fast forward 2 years, the case study is done, and we have all this information that shows how effective that they have actually been.
Hmm.
And then they use that information to improve the program itself. What can we do to make the program even more effective based on this data that we've received from these researchers? And a lot of them have been able now to go to donors to say, look, there's actually research showing that we're making an impact in this community. If it's substance abuse treatment, if it's violence reduction program for gangs, if it's housing like the homelessness study, or if it's in some other area. We've done so many of these case studies, and I don't know how many we refer to in the book. Maybe 20 or 30 case
Yeah.
studies are highlighted in the book itself. And we continue to do these case studies every year. And so I think it, A, helps them to have some sense of accountability about what they're doing. If they are faith-based, they should be willing to be scrutinized. And we think that that's just an exercise of stewardship on the part of these organizations to undergo scrutiny like this. And then they wind up improving their products, their organization as a result of the research. And so it kind of becomes a win-win.
Yeah, and the other point I want to make, and this is part of creating kind of more mainstream awareness of faith-based organizations, is we are not simply targeting Christian universities and seminaries. The textbook is written in a way that it can and should be adopted by secular universities, especially groups that are in areas of public policy and social work. If nothing more, to make them aware there is a huge resource rich in volunteers and committed people that can help tackle what, seem to be a lot of overwhelming social problems. So we are very eager in our efforts to promote the book to target secular universities as well.
Yeah, and I definitely think to what you guys have both pointed to, that is one of the strengths of the book as well. We mentioned before that a lot of this comes from personal experience, but it is, it's a book of case studies, really and truly. There is empirical data, there are facts, there is research that has been done. And like you said, I think that it has broader implications than just Christian universities and seminaries, but in some ways, just social welfare in general and just community outreach, social work, sociology, many fields I think can benefit from this book. And so we appreciate what you guys have done there. And so this next question kind of veers a little bit off of what you just said, but what difference does the faith aspect of an FBO play in community engagement as opposed to a similar secular organization? Have you noticed a difference? Is there a difference? And then in what ways do you think this can be improved? Are there any negative aspects to an organization being faith-based?
Well, that's a great question that you ask. And of course, we're biased.
Sure, yeah.
We always try to be as objective as we can as scholars. I mean, we're willing to tell people tough news if the data indicate that. But in general, it's a positive story. And faith basically is the motivating factor for why people do what they do. There are plenty of volunteers that work in these organizations. They don't get paid at all.
Yeah.
And if you ask them, why do you do this? Why are you mentoring all these at-risk kids? What's in it for you? And they basically say, I'm the beneficiary.
Yeah.
I get to see a kid's life turned around. I get to see this behavioral change, this trajectory change. And so this encourages me. It lifts my spirits. It gives me hope. It gives me meaning and purpose to be able just to volunteer. And I think this is huge because for a lot of these people, if you're going to mentor a kid in an inner city that has issues, this is hard work. This is not like fun. I mean, it can be encouraging and powerful. A lot of it is just plain hard work, and people do it because they're called. They're just answering a call. And so over and over, we hear that, I'm called to do this and it's difficult, but I do it. I mean, I've talked to so many mentors that go into prison to work with prisoners to teach them how to read and to write and how to balance a checkbook and help them with life skills. And this is time that they could be on vacation, but they're in prison helping prisoners. They're answering a call. And so I think this is what sets these faith-based groups apart from someone who's paid to be a probation officer or a parole officer who's working with the same kind of offender and they're getting paid to do it. Now, I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with that. That's wonderful. But maybe they don't have the same calling necessarily on their lives that some of these volunteers have.
Hmm.
So again, the faith dimension is huge. And people have this opinion, I would call it a stereotype, that faith-based organizations are all about proselytizing. And William mentioned this earlier. By that, they think that these organizations exist to convert people to a particular religion. And the reality is, this is just inaccurate. We have not come across one organization that says, you know what, if you'll agree to pray this prayer with me, then we're going to give you food or we're going to provide this service. But it's contingent upon you making this statement of faith. That really, I'm sure it exists, but it's very rare. It's quite the opposite. It's how can we minister to you? What needs do you have physically and materially? How can we help you meet these needs? What, socially as well. And then there is hope, of course, among a lot of them that the faith dimension will actually rub off, that people will say, there's something different about you. We don't know why you're helping us, but we appreciate it. What makes you different? And then people may say, well, it's my faith that makes me different. And then those conversations can naturally emerge. But the whole proselytizing thing, in many ways, I think is a smokescreen for people that are critical of the work of these what I would call champions.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a key misperception that people have. I also think among staff and volunteers, you probably find more people in the faith-based groups with lived experience. You know, ex-prisoners who would go so far as to say, I was put in this situation of imprisonment for the purpose. Bob Woodson talks about the Josephs, referring to Joseph in the Bible becoming imprisoned and then all the things that emanated from there. And there's a very strong sense with a lot of people that have lived experience that, and again, as Byron said, you know, they have been saved. And I use that in the broadest sense, in the
Mm.
most holistic sense. And they feel a very strong calling to be there and to help others in the situation that they were in. And I think that that is characteristic of a lot of the programs that we saw. And I think the other thing in terms of, you know, there are a lot of very fine and very effective secular organizations. So we certainly don't pit them against faith-based groups. But one element that we've seen, and we talk about this in the concluding chapter, is an understanding of relationship. We talk about charities, talk about commodity-based charities and relationship-based charities. And commodity-based is important. People are hungry, they need food, they need furniture, but that's really a temporary Band-Aid. And a lot of faith-based groups are really about helping people transform their lives. And
Mm.
again, not in the strictly spiritual, although that's an important component, but in terms of life habits, in terms of relationship skills. And in the concluding chapter, we coined a term, nurturing human connectedness,
Mm.
as a theme that we saw across the board. It doesn't mean that you just like the Bible says, you don't just to say be well and not do anything, but there's a recognition that everything starts and ends with relationship, and relationship and social supports are an element that we found in many of the programs we studied.
Are all of the faith-based organizations that you guys did case studies on Christian organizations, or are there other faith or other religious organizations?
Christianity, as you might expect, dominates the faith-based movement in the United States. And the case studies that we've done are Christian. That
Okay.
doesn't mean that there aren't Muslim faith-based groups that are doing
Sure.
good work.
Yeah.
We've actually been connected to a few people who've said, look, there's this Islamic prison program that it's the counterpart to a Christian-based program, and we would love for you guys to, in the future, to consider doing a case study. And we're completely open to that. Most of these case studies require at least some funding
Sure.
to complete. So I do think that in the future, I'm hopeful that we'll be able to look at other religious groups and the work that they're doing. But one of the things that William said a moment ago, Anna Kate, that I wanted to come back to
Yeah.
is this holistic view of the work of faith-based organizations. So the federal government on homelessness, they have something called Housing First,
Mm.
which is a huge federal program within HUD, and it's based on providing a residence for people that are homeless. But we would argue that the gospel rescue missions and these other faith-based groups are interested not just in providing housing, but providing job skills, drug counseling, life skills counseling, and if one is interested, spiritual help.
Yeah.
And because of the work that we're now doing in human flourishing, in fact, I do direct something called the Institute for Studies of Religion, but we've just launched a new institute called the Institute for Global Human Flourishing. And one of the great things about flourishing is that we're looking at all aspects of a person's life.
Yeah.
So you may be doing really well physically, but emotionally you're a wreck.
Mm.
You're considering suicide. You're using drugs. So there are these areas of life maybe that are not doing well at all, and you may be having, financial difficulties, and you may be isolated. You're not in relationship with other people.
Yeah.
These are all domains that taken together form a flourishing life. And so, one of the things that we're finding when we're doing these studies of flourishing is that religion is a very powerful predictor of who is and who isn't flourishing.
Yeah.
And so, if you're the government, we don't expect the government to go out and minister to people's spiritual needs. But we do think that these spiritual needs are worth looking at and they shouldn't be overlooked.
Yeah.
And I think these faith based groups are responding to something that government can't respond to, and that is the spiritual dimension, which again, we're finding is one of the key predictors, not just here in the United States, but around the world of who's flourishing and who isn't.
Yeah. I think you're right in that respect. And I think it is an important part, right, of faith based organizations that, although, as William pointed out, they're not, you need to say this prayer or do this ritual in order for us to help you, but that they aren't blocking that off as an option either, that is still, a part of the holistic help and healing that they can offer.
They're
Yeah.
also great partners. I think there's the view that faith based organizations are rather isolationist. They exist and they don't work with other groups, but this is not the case. Go to any city in America and you'll find that faith based organizations tend to be great collaborators.
Yeah.
They'll want to work with government, they'll work with other private groups that are not faith based.
Right.
And so I think this too is a common misconception is that faith-based groups think it's their way or the highway. And we haven't found that to be the case.
Yeah, I think the HUD example, HUD delivers its services through these jurisdictions called continuums of care.
Huh.
And in many of these places, faith-based homeless providers who get $0 of government money have staff engaging and participating in these continuum of care meetings for the purpose of coordinating resources. So I agree with Byron is that a lot of these faith-based ministries, they don't participate only with entities that give them money. They're leaders in the community and they are, key partners in coordinating efforts locally.
That's very helpful. And I wonder if you guys could maybe give us a taste. Which of the case studies given in your textbook do you feel is the most impactful, and then why? So you don't have to go into the entirety of the case study, but maybe just a taste of one of the more impactful or significant case studies in your book.
So we did a case study on the prison entrepreneurship program, which is started in Houston with a group of Christian businessmen that thought, what if we were to go into prison and work with prisoners that want to work with us, and we can teach them how to develop a business plan so that when they get out of prison, they can launch their own business. And so I thought, what a great program. And so we went in, did this case study on the prison entrepreneurship program, and we did a return on investment study, and it was just incredible the amount of good work and goodwill that they do in the Houston area. So get this, employment is one of the biggest hurdles to living a crime-free life when they
Yeah.
get out of prison. And a lot of these guys come back. We found the employment rate higher among ex-prisoners than the public at large if they participated in the prison entrepreneurship program.
Wow.
Meaning, the unemployment rate was like 1%, something minuscule. And so it's a paradigm shift to think of prisoners maybe owning their own business.
Yeah.
And so when we did that case study, the prison entrepreneurship program was able to beef up their work even more because they could show the study to their supporters and to potential donors. And so it was a huge shot in the arm for that ministry. And that was in like 2012 or 2013. And to this day, they're still using that case study on their program, which now has the opportunity to spread across the country. So that's one example that comes to mind, but I know William will have a different example.
Well, the thing that I want to highlight, we do talk about models for collaboration between faith-based groups and the government. We do have a lot of material from George W. Bush, who launched the White House Office on Faith-Based and Community Initiatives. And there's a there's a type of organization that was critical in forging those partnerships that were referred to as intermediaries.
Hmm.
You can imagine some of these, local faith-based ministries are of a distinctly different culture and language of a lot of government agencies, let alone, the onerous process of filling out a federal grant. Intermediaries were promoted through something called the Compassion Capital Fund. And essentially, they were the go-between. They had the administrative capacity to fill out grants and meet those requirements, but they also had the knowledge and skills to interact with these local ministries who were doing great work, but, were administratively limited. And one of the organizations, I think it shows up in 3 different chapters, they're so good, is the Latino Coalition, which is led by Richard Ramos, now led by Richard Morales out of Denver. And they have done some stellar work, not only in working with these local groups, but helping build their capacity as ministries so that they can serve more. And I think one of the important lessons is there are small, powerful, faith-based ministries that are meant to be small, powerful, faith-based ministries. Others are willing and able to scale up. And a lot of the efforts at building the capacity of ministries is to increase their ability to serve more people.
Yeah.
So I think the Latino Coalition was really kind of a model intermediary, still functions today, manages some grants through the Department of Labor, but they're one of my favorites.
Sure. Yeah. I'm sure you guys could name countless FBOs that have been influential in communities and even in these studies. And so I wonder, just as a final question, what gaps in the scholarship do you feel like this textbook is fulfilling? And what role do you see it as playing in the future of social welfare? I know you guys mentioned, that you hope this won't be limited to solely Christian universities and seminaries. In the broader scholarship, do you feel like there was kind of an absence here that this book is filling? And then, do you hope that it will play a particular role within social welfare?
Yeah, I think there's a huge gap. Religion is an overlooked variable. So if you talk to economists and you mention, have you ever thought about studying religion? Most economists will go, what? I
Yeah.
mean, it never entered their mind, but yet religion affects our economy in enormous ways. So
Mm,
religion tends to be overlooked no matter the discipline. So in my own work in the social sciences, there's just been a tendency for scholars to not think about religion because the reality is in the social sciences, in the academy, there are very small numbers of actively religious people. And so it's a highly secular group. And so for them, it never enters their mind that religion might be an important thing to actually look at.
yeah.
So there are many gaps. That's why, we continue to do studies in journals that call attention to this. But again, so many of these groups are unable to afford research, and the government doesn't want to fund research on religion. And so, since the government's not funding this work, that's why we've taken it upon ourselves to do the case studies as best we can with limited resources, just to bring attention and meet
Mm,
some of these gaps that you're talking about.
yeah.
Yeah, I think, again, part of the larger issue is giving credit where credit's due. And in the absence of research that would demonstrate this, trying to create the visibility. I think the idea of a textbook is particularly important because oftentimes even faith-based universities are using textbooks that really are based in some very secular and perhaps even unspiritual views or contrary to their faith. And, we really hope that this not only provides representation of the work of faith-based groups, but it also, I think, underlying it, we're in a very kind of divisive, polarizing society, and we've seen that. And really, in many respects, the faith-based initiative promotes pluralism.
Mm,
And what I mean by that is let's focus on the social problems,
yeah.
you know, and let's recognize that government resources, whether applied well or not, are insufficient.
Mm,
And the resources of community groups may not be sufficient. How much more impact can be had when there's efforts to coordinate and to collaborate? So often the government's in its own little universe doing its thing. So the opportunity to coordinate has been missed. And just from a practical standpoint, given the enormity of these social problems that we talk about in the textbook, it just makes sense to draw on all the resources that you have. And I think this textbook argues that there is a huge untapped resource of volunteers, of people with lived experience, people who have developed effective ministries, and there needs to, this is the first effort to do some knowledge sharing.
Yeah.
So I'd really like to see the textbook in seminaries, in Christian colleges, even in nonprofit leadership training, places like
Mm.
the DeVos Institute that trains up a lot of ministry leaders. And obviously we're biased. We'd like as many people as possible to buy the book, but it is one of its kind. And we learned that from the people that kind of reviewed our initial efforts. And, we're hoping, like Byron said, we already have more case studies queued up for the next edition.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate you guys so much, and thank you for taking the time to be with us today. For those who are listening, if you'd like to purchase The Faith Factor and Social Welfare, please go to BaylorPress.com. You can pre-order it there. We are looking forward to the release of this book. Thank you guys so much for being here.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for listening to Et Al, a podcast from Baylor University Press. We hope you've enjoyed today's episode. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to keep up with the latest from Et Al.